Hello, welcome back again. Today I'm going to look at a video by Dr. Susan Oliver where she draws comparisons between Lucy Letby supporters and anti-vaxxers, she claims. Susan Oliver has done a number of videos talking about myths and conspiracy theories about vaccines. I can only really judge that by the topics she's covered, because I can't really stand listening to her. She talks in the most patronising way imaginable, and it's hard to believe she actually changes anybody's mind. Nevertheless, just based on the titles of her videos, I'm in complete agreement with the topics she talks about in those vaccine videos. In January 2025, she posted this video about Lucy Letby, where she says many of the supporters, but not all, are anti-vaxxers. And yes, she does seem to be correct about that. Similarly, in the post office scandal, Ron Warmington, who was one of the Second Sight investigators who uncovered the scandal, or contributed a lot to uncovering the scandal, also has many beliefs outside the mainstream. He has tweeted about how climate change is a hoax, for example, and calls people concerned about climate change zealots. But the fact that he has a view outside the mainstream on that does not change the fact he was correct about the post office. I talked about this in one of my blogs, the one about the Dreyfus affair, and I noted there that the supporters of Dreyfus tended to be people outside the mainstream of society at the time. I think this is almost an inevitable thing that happens. When you get a case like the Letby prosecution, at the start, after the verdict was delivered, it was only people outside the mainstream who were really able to forcefully comment. There might have been people murmuring that it seemed a bit wrong, and I was more in that group to start with. It's only people outside the mainstream who have less to lose, who can really go in forcefully from the start. In the Dreyfus affair, there were lots of socialists and communists supporting Dreyfus. When something becomes a culture war like that, it polarises people further one way or the other. People who were supporting Dreyfus were toxic to the mainstream of society. There are also Jewish people, campaigners against anti-Semitism, and various socialites, and I think one was an actress who spent much of her day resting in a coffin. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but it was things that in French society at the time were deemed a threat to the conservative ruling order, the Catholic Church in particular. And because a lot of people like that were supporting him, it became difficult for people in the mainstream of society to change their view. And I think something's probably happened like that with Susan here. She's seen that a lot of anti-vaxxers are supporting Lucy Letby. Therefore, the Letby issue becomes a proxy for anti-vax, so it's therefore something she needs to oppose alongside anti-vax. That's not to suggest she's not genuine in her belief. I think she is, but there's cognitive bias going on in all of us, and that probably would have influenced her more in one direction near the start. But I just think it's really bizarre how even now, when the 14-member panel of world-leading experts has clearly come out in the opposite direction to her, she's just doubled down and is now claiming she's debunking this world-leading expert panel. Obviously none of them are using anti-vax arguments, so that point just seems to have been abandoned. And she's dropped that line of argument and is now just saying whatever they say, it's bollocks, and she's debunking it. In Susan's video, she starts off by looking at a tweet where the person is, I think, making a joke about Madame Tussauds, and she seems to take that as a genuine belief in a conspiracy theory. Seems a bit unlikely that's intended as a serious tweet to me. It's difficult to say because we don't have any explanation of it. She then says that there are various versions of a conspiracy against Lucy Letby. A popular one is that doctors decided to use her as a scapegoat. And she says, where have we heard that before? Well, I'm not really sure where we have heard that before, because I looked into that with anti-vaxxers, and I'm not familiar with any claims by anti-vaxxers where they claim that they're being scapegoated. The only reference to scapegoating I can find is here, where it says that anti-vaxxers are scapegoating people, but that's the other way round. That's a response to anti-vaxxers are saying that the anti-vaxxers are doing the scapegoating, which in the example given there is correct. So that does not appear to match up. Susan then talks about a paper by John O. Quigley, which he claims was rejected because the publishers didn't like the topic, and she criticises him for saying this. I also am not particularly enamoured of John O. Quigley either. I think he is overstressing the importance of pure numerical statistics in how the case was brought. There are statistical claims by the prosecution, and they are significant, but they're more implied claims about things being unlikely, very unlikely, and so on. And I think going in on the raw numbers as much as he does is not the most important thing in the case. There's a couple of things she points out. She says, Susan says that he had said the RCPCH report had contained a blistering criticism, and she says this is a wild exaggeration. But it isn't a wild exaggeration at all. The report found significant gaps in medical and nursing rotas, poor decision-making and insufficient senior cover, and the conclusion of the report was that the medical staffing was sufficient for a special care baby unit, that's a level 1 unit, but it was inadequate for a high dependency level 2 unit. And Susan downplays this by saying that other hospitals in the UK were just as bad. That is not the same as it being a wild exaggeration to say that the report made blistering criticisms. First of all, other hospitals in the UK have had serious problems with neonatal and maternity care. The term maternity scandal was already being talked about before this case even started, and there have been other hospitals with large clusters of baby deaths. Secondly, you can have several things bad, but only one of them have a disaster. I think Dr. Breary in this case referred to the Challenger, so I'm going to make the analogy to the Challenger as well. There were 27 launches of the space shuttle, and all of them had the same problem as was present on the final Challenger launch, which led to the disaster. The 26 initial launches got away with it and didn't explode, and it was only the 27th one that exploded. Things happen randomly and non-linearly, so there could just be some tiny chaotic trigger that finally pushes things into disaster, even if the disaster was being stored up all along. And I think that's really the point that Lucy Letby supporters are making, is that this could happen in other places as well, even if it hasn't already. Susan then goes on to say about the sewage backing up into the sinks, and she says there was one example of this. Well, that sounds pretty bad to me. And she says, well, none of the babies died of an infection anyway. That is begging the question to an extreme degree. That's an extremely controversial point in the case. There is definitely considerable evidence that some of the babies did die of infections. Certainly not all of them, but certainly some. And the way the case was brought was, again, just to go back to the previous video, the way the case was brought was not that positive methods were identified, it was that other things were supposedly ruled out. So it's a major point of controversy in the case whether infection was actually ruled out. Susan then goes on to say that another parallel with anti-vaxxers, in her opinion, is making one person the target of hate, and she compares it to Anthony Fauci, who she describes, correctly as far as I know, as a brilliant doctor, and then compares this to Lucy Letby supporters making Dr. Dowie Evans the villain. I mean, this seems an extreme stretch to me. You could basically notice this in pretty much any disagreement about anything, couldn't you? Surely any time there's a big argument about something, people are going to have complaints about the other side. For example, you could say that vaccine supporters are using the same arguments as anti-vaxxers because they or we made Dr. Andrew Wakefield a big figure of hate. Okay, I suppose you could say he's not a brilliant doctor, but then also neither is Dowie Evans, as far as I can see. There's this blistering criticism of him by Lord Justice Jackson. Dr. Evans comes from this school of thought going back to Roy Meadow, who was the chief expert in the Sally Clark case, and they had these old rules of thumb about parents and cot deaths. The purported Meadows law was that one cot death in a family is acceptable, but 2 is suspicious, and 3 is always murder, for example. And I strongly suspect that Dowie Evans is following something like this when he got involved in this case. So I want to talk about pseudoscience now. Susan Oliver is fighting pseudoscience. Let's look back at some previous cases like Sally Clark and say and ask the question, does this method work? Is there a history of looking at medical records after a cluster of infant deaths like this, or a single infant death that you say you can't explain? Does this have a good record of working? Are there controls that you can compare this to and say, yes, we can really reliably distinguish murder cases from natural deaths? If you look at Sally Clark's initial appeal, it is extremely similar to Lucy Letby's appeal as well. I'm tempted to say Lucy Letby's first appeal because I'm extremely confident there will eventually be another. Sally Clark's first appeal, the judges went through the doctor's findings, laid out all these things they'd noticed, minor injuries in the babies, bleeding in certain places and absence of bleeding in others, and the doctors had used this to say with absolute certainty that she'd murdered this baby. When it came to her second appeal, it was then revealed that they had withheld significant evidence of infection in the babies, and the convictions were quashed. And since then, everyone has accepted Sally Clark was innocent. The findings of all those injuries which the doctors were absolutely certain proved murder were just forgotten about, really. In the public imagination, the whole thing's remembered as the 73 million to 1 odds claim, but that was really only a peripheral part of it. In the case of Lindy Chamberlain, not a cluster case, it was a single infant death. Suspicions were immediately pointed at her as well, based on pseudoscience, like her behaviour, her mannerism, lack of emotion, things like that. And the explanation, which was the explanation she put forward, that her child had been snatched by a wild dog, was dismissed because experts had purported to find blood in her car, and it later turned out that the test they used for that blood was completely unreliable and it detected blood everywhere. At the time, would someone have criticising this test have been accused of using the same arguments as anti-vaxxers? In a very broad, sort of vague way, you could say, well, these people doubt that thing about scientists, and these people doubt that thing about scientists, therefore they're exactly the same. Well, in a very, very broad sense, yes. Some other British cases are Angela Canning's, Donna Anthony, Suzanne Holdsworth, and Kieran Henderson, all cases where there were either one or a cluster of infant deaths under the care of a mother, and the police got tunnel vision. They used these Meadow-inspired techniques and purportedly ruled out any natural causes of death. I think all of those cases have been extremely heavily brought into question and I would say discredited. So looking back at this method that Dowie Evans has used here, I would say this entire field of investigation could fairly be described as a pseudoscience. It has no controls, it has no repeatability, and when it keeps being shown not to work, nothing changes and it just keeps on being used. Suzanne Holdsworth case, I would say, is very similar in that the baby she was caring for died very suddenly, and rather than actually try to investigate what happened, they declared it murder because it couldn't be explained. They wrote this story about her bashing the child's head against the banisters, but they didn't actually inspect the banisters or anything like that. It was the same method that Evans has used here of ruling out other possibilities, and then once you've done that, you declare it settled. Evans has been described by YouTuber Mark Mays, not someone I agree with on everything, but generally a compassionate and thoughtful person. He's been described by Mark Mays as a nutter, and while I don't really endorse that language, I think the gist of that is fair, really. Obviously, one of the problems you've got is that some parents do sadly harm their children. The problem is that in itself is not enough to point that out, because you could just as well say that many people tell lies, but the fact that many people tell lies does not mean that lie detectors work or that lie detectors are a good science. And similarly, just because there are many people who are both generous and like to keep a careful control on the purse strings, that does not prove that astrology works. That's kind of the point of pseudoscience, really, is that you can accidentally make it line up by chance. So with a pseudoscientific method of police investigation, you can sometimes accidentally catch guilty people. If you didn't, it wouldn't be so persistent in the first place. It's because of that problem that it needs any debate or it needs any scrutiny at all. Let's have a look at what Lord Justice Jackson said about Evans's evidence in that previous case. So this is from Mr. Myers cross-examining Dowie Evans in the trial again, and Myers is reading into the record the decision by Lord Justice Jackson where he discusses Dr. Evans's report in this earlier case. In this case, Evans is supporting the parents and opposing the authorities. So I suppose it's correct that, as he claims, he doesn't always act for one side. What he does seem to do, though, is he goes all in for the side that's instructed him and doesn't seem to pay too much attention to providing any kind of balanced opinion. So in this case, a care order had been made against these parents, presumably based on abuse of their children. Evans, writing a report to support them, had supported the case being reopened, despite the fact that the newborn baby had sustained 9 fractures on at least 2 separate occasions. So, in going back to Letby, in the case of baby O, Evans looked at the files, and because he discovered 1 bruise, within 10 minutes he declared that to be a murder. But when he's working for the parents in this other case, there are 9 fractures on 2 occasions on this newborn baby, yet he still writes a report supporting the parents and actually trying to appeal a decision that had already been made, trying to reopen the entire case. You don't need to be an expert, a medical expert, to know that something can't be right here. It's like you don't need to be an engineer to know that 1,000 kilograms is more than 500 kilograms. You can see which is worse, and obviously 9 fractures on 2 occasions in a newborn baby. If that is not inflicted injury, then he cannot possibly have been correct in his opinion on the Letby case. And then we've got the, I think by now better known conclusion from Lord Justice Jackson saying, finally, and of greatest concern, Dr. Evans makes no effort to provide a balanced opinion. He either knows what his professional colleagues have concluded and disregards it, or he has not taken steps to inform himself of their views. Either approach amounts to a breach of proper professional conduct. No attempt has been made to engage with the full range of medical information or the powerful contradictory indicators. Instead, the report has the hallmarks of an exercise in working out an explanation that exculpates the applicants. It ends with tendentious and partisan expressions of opinion that are outside Dr. Evans's professional competence and have no place in a reputable expert report. So I don't know if Susan thinks Lord Justice Jackson is using the arguments of an anti-vaxxer in criticising Dr. Evans here or not, but I don't think so. And for a second time, I'd argue that in Letby that's the point where the case should have been stopped. I've no idea whether these parents in this earlier case were guilty or not. It's quite possible, for all I know, that the original case against them was put together by someone also using the Meadow method and ignoring explanations like the one that Evans claims applies here, low vitamin D. He actually then goes on to say he's very upset about this because until this he had a 100% record in the family court. Again, he doesn't seem to understand the point at all that he's not supposed to be fighting for the side that instructs him as an expert. His duty is to the court and to provide a correct opinion, not to fight for his own client like a lawyer would. After he was asked about this, Evans started making speeches and he had to keep being told to stop by the lawyer and the judge. He accused Myers of using a diversionary tactic by bringing this up and saying, oh, won't you think of the poor parents and all sorts of things like that. Evans also tried to claim that this wasn't really a report, it was just a letter to the solicitor. When it's put to him by Myers that it says report of Dr. Evans at the top, he absurdly says, oh, that's just something I write on all my letters. Susan's next point is about the roster table. She claims, as was being claimed widely after the conviction, that this roster chart with all the X's under Lucy Letby's name was put together solely based on suspicious incidents and not based on her being on duty. Susan says that Dr. Evans wasn't told in advance who they were suspicious of. He just identified the cases, and when they checked, she was present for all of them. So that is now known to be wrong. We saw in the previous video about Baby I that Evans was coming up with false positives all over the place. He was coming up with multiple theories. He knew when he had to find something suspicious, and he was determined to find a reason that it would be suspicious. There were apparently many other examples where he identified suspicious events that they couldn't tie Lucy Letby to, and those charges were dropped, and they were dropped both as charges and they're also dropped from this chart. Susan also says that it's a fact that Dr. Evans had never met the consultants at the Countess before. There's some circumstantial evidence that this may not be true. We don't know definitively, but I think it's wrong for her to accept that as a fact. Just because he says that, it's another form of begging the question, I would say. There's circumstantial evidence that there was a very strong opportunity where they could have come into contact at a paediatric conference in Chester. And there's also the fact that Dr. Evans and the consultants both misinterpreted Shuley's paper on pulmonary air embolism in the wrong way, and both wrongly thought it was about venous air embolism. Susan finishes by saying that the medical evidence and the shift chart were not the only evidence presented in the trial, which she's correct about. Might come back to that more another time, but I've touched on it in my video comparing the claims of a coincidence between The Wizard of Oz and The Dark Side of the Moon. Susan, absurdly, I think, recommends Crime Scene to Courtroom's channel to see this evidence. Unfortunately, I've had cause to look at his channel. It seems to omit a lot of the problems with the case and focuses heavily on the prosecution closing speech and the prosecution's cross-examination of Lucy. I've written a blog on the Seema Misra case in the post office scandal, and I've noted there some of the manipulative prosecution tactics that were used, and I can't help noticing that a lot of those same tactics seem to be present in the transcripts that Crime Scene to Courtroom emphasises heavily. For example, allegations that a person's lying about very trivial or immaterial points, particularly in Lucy's case where they're things that she could have forgotten. He claims the strongest evidence is cross-examination of Lucy Letby, where she's asked about whether she was going to wear underwear on a date with a doctor and what she's wearing when she's arrested, and various people claim that she's lied about these things. It's completely irrelevant to the case as far as I can see. It's incomprehensible how this could be relevant to the case. And I've actually written a blog about some of this questioning, which veers strongly into misogyny. And there's also another Reddit post about the clothes during arrest issue. Susan actually tweeted after the New Yorker piece was released that she couldn't believe the evidence was that thin. And, well, it does seem like it is that thin. If all she's found other than that is the Crime Scene to Courtroom transcripts talking about underwear and pyjamas when being arrested, it definitely remains that thin, I'm afraid. And as a final example here, I'll just give you a tweet from apparently supporter of guilt on Twitter using what I would describe as a flat earth argument that can be boiled down to denial of reality followed by laugh emoji. And perhaps we can look forward to Susan's criticism of this flat earth style of argument.